Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger of bloggingforjobs.com, for a 45-minute in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, here's your host, Jessica, with this episode of Workology.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Workology podcast. It's great to have you on. This podcast is part of the Blogging for Jobs and Recruiters Lounge blog family. In 2014, the conference board found that the topic of talent was among the top priorities for a CEO, which I'm not surprised. It's something my guest has been talking about for many years. I first met Joni on Twitter in 2009. She was one of the most forward-thinking, and still is, CEOs and business leaders today. I remember talking to her on Twitter and then scheduling a call and just being so excited and really hopeful for the future of talent acquisition, human resources, and just business in general. She really understood this social media thing. Today, we're going to be talking about HR and workplace trends as we begin to look into 2015. So I'm going to introduce Joni. Joni, welcome to the Workology podcast.
Thank you, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit about Joni Doolin. What do you do and who are you? Give us the scoop.
Well, sadly, I have fallen into that group that speaks in headlines. And so I pulled my Twitter headlines, to meet your audience. I'm the founder and the CEO of a company called TDN2K. TDN2K stands for Transforming Data into Knowledge. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But we're a business intelligence and software company, but we serve the service sector workplace. Our first company was People Report, which I am also the CEO of that company and founded that company. And that's where Jessica and I connected. And as a result of that, a lot of the work and passion is wrapped around great places to work. And understanding that workplace. Our claim to fame, and it's been a tagline for years, is serving as a catalyst for companies seeking to balance people and profits, which sounds simple, but as everyone listening to this probably understands, it's not. And we still do that. And People Report was one of those companies that was actually created on the back of a napkin. And it was, it's been almost 20 years ago, but that idea and the company was founded by myself, but supported by a group of chief people officers who at the time were, and remember this was almost 2 decades ago, were incredibly frustrated about the lack of real hard data and information about the people side of the P&L. We refer to it as human capital, and I use that expression too, but sometimes I don't really like it. But definitely the people side of the P&L. So, in the interim, our company has grown. We have a couple other brands called Black Box Intelligence, which measures financial capital. And we have our newest brand, White Box Social Intelligence, which measures social information and capital. So again, we're still trying to connect the dots across the enterprise to help we call our clients, our members, help the members of our consortium really understand and drive performance in their business.
Awesome. Well, you guys provide so much great support and information to a lot of different people. And we're talking about workplace and HR trends. And you are somewhat, I think, of a visionary in this space. And when you hear you talk, I always just get goosebumps because you're talking about the future of people, the future of business, and how those two things intertwine. One of the things that I think is interesting for the space that you work in particularly, and the business that you do, is that you guys focus a lot in the restaurant and hospitality industries. And in my mind, these particular industries tend to be sort of trendsetters. And I think for that reason is because the staff typically in those industries is the younger sort of up and comers as people are growing in some of their first jobs. I know my first job was with Hardee's when I was 16 years old. What's interesting in working in hearing you speak and members of the events and the conferences that you guys put on, which are fabulous, is that the people who are part of this community of yours have grown up many times in the industry. So it's just fabulous. So, and for that reason, I just kind of wanted to talk with you about trends, because I think that you have a unique perspective, and that the people who are working in these restaurants and hotels and different places and stores, this is they're the future of work.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And thank you for your kind comments about, and you're right. I mentioned before that we started this group almost 20 years ago, and we are actually planning our 20th Global Best Practices Conference next January. And as a result of that, I'm spending a lot of my time right now really studying the companies and the people leading those companies, both from an HR perspective and an operations perspective, and really digging into what's the same, what has changed. So it's perfect timing to be talking about trends and what we think is coming in the future.
So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the most important trends for HR in the workplace? Like if we're looking back, what have been the most important this year?
So for 2014, it's interesting that you said, who was it that said talent, the CEO survey that said talent was one of the top 5?
It's a conference board survey.
A conference board. Okay. So, certainly that was prescient. And I think it underlies what happened in 2014, that is the beginning of this huge shift. So we report quarterly a workforce index through People Report. And that workforce index essentially measures employment pressures and recruitment difficulty. So that's something I think a lot of your audience would be really interested in. And we have been reporting that workforce index quarterly now through 2 business cycles, and the peaks and the valleys. And last September, this September 2014, that index actually hit a number that we haven't seen since fourth quarter 2007. Which was right at the peak of the last super hot job market. And, obviously it had been trending up all year. And, we believe, and the research is telling us, that shift that's been occurring all year is going to be foundational to just about any workplace issue that we tackle going forward. We just published a blog along with a commentary from our retained economist, a man by the name of Joel Naroff, that was entitled, "The Employer's Market is Already Over." Really? It is. And that's already baked into 2014. Whether companies are acknowledging it or responding to it or not, it really is baked into 2014. And I think, that we will remember this year as when the market shifted again. And we have our the service sector employers that we are studying, they've been increasingly confronted this year with triple witching of Affordable Care Act, minimum wage, and employee activism. And, certainly those 3 issues, they didn't just start in 2014, but they're really coming to a head in 2014. And again, in restaurant, retail, the inability to get any sensible immigration reform passed has sort of iced the cake. So And as you know, Jessica, more than most, all of that is playing out in social. So in the world of HR, those trends are requiring generalists to either learn on their feet or find some specialists that can start to tackle those issues. And I think 2014, again, we're going to remember because we're seeing a reemergence of labor relations as a discipline. But even that discipline itself is changing rapidly because of all the social implications. So that would be my laundry list of what we experienced in 2014.
So two things. I want to just say that we will link to some information on Blogging for Jobs in relation to this podcast regarding the Workforce Index Quarterly, things that you guys publish publicly, just to kind of give people a sense of what they're seeing and why it would be important to have access to the information that you guys are providing. And then also the Economist blog. I have particularly been interested in what economists are saying about this market. So I think for me personally, that will be of interest for me also. So we'll include those in the post on Blogging for Jobs. So if you just look for Joni Doolin when you go to bloggingforjobs.com, just go to the right-hand sidebar of the blog into the search box, and you will be directed to those things. Or certainly we'll provide some links to how to get in touch with Joni and find that information on their website and resources as well.
Mm-hmm. No, and particularly the blog that I referenced, I would suggest that everybody in your audience takes the time to read it, because essentially what Joel is talking about is the fact that the market's already tightened and it's just a matter of time until wages are going to start to rise. And he's predicting that when that happens, not if it happens, but when that happens, that those increases could be really sharp. So anybody who is trying to do planning for 2015 and beyond needs to be factoring that in. And, I really love this man. He's a highly respected economist. He writes and speaks for Bloomberg and numerous other outlets, MSNBC. But he has a favorite saying that says, if you get your economics from a politician, you get the economy that you deserve. Oh. And, I happen to believe that he's right. And so his insight we find very valuable.
Another thing I wanted to mention that you were talking about was labor relations, because I think that is something that isn't being talked about enough in this space. And for example, I subscribe to a number of text messages from a number, maybe 4 or 5 different union organizations that are using technology as simple as SMS, which is just a form of text message. And so today I got a text message that says to me, all employees should have Thanksgiving off. Let's support employees that are having to work on Thanksgiving. Text your zip code and we'll show you where the nearest Black Friday protest is. So this is how these union organizations are gaining access to your employee population, whether you're in retail or service or hospitality or not. People don't necessarily realize what is happening here. But I like to follow the text messages because it keeps me informed and helping to educate also the HR population about what they should be expecting. The tactics have gotten really aggressive within the last 3 or 4 months, I'll say.
Yes, they have. Yes, they have. And I know you have Michael Vandervoort is one of your bloggers and experts. And of course, Mike is, he is really an expert, certainly at traditional labor relations, but he has been one of the leading experts in the emergence of social in terms of how it impacts both the strategy of the activist and the response of the business. And these are waters that have not been navigated by many people in the world of HR.
We'll also link to Mike and his blog. He has a lot of good nuggets. His Twitter feed is particularly, I think, beneficial to anybody who is not really sure why to use Twitter. He's sharing information in real time that he's reading and digesting. I'm trying to get Mike also on the podcast. He has a new job and gigs, so he's trying to get settled. But we'll bring him on, and some of the things that he had, situations that he's worked with, and the trends that he's seeing, they're a little scary.
They are. Yes, they are.
HR in particular is an area that I'm obviously passionate about, and personally I feel that HR has gotten a lot of bad press, especially when it comes to the Harvard Business Review. There's been a number of articles that have been surfacing suggesting that HR be split into two separate departments, an administrative and a strategy department. Now, I'll include the link in the published version of the podcast, but it's called "It's Time to Split HR." Where do you see the future of HR going, Joni?
Well, first of all, I'll point out that I remember getting ready for a best practices conference, I think in about '05. And one of the cover stories was "Let's just kill HR." So, possibly splitting it is kinder than what their position was, a decade ago. HR is going the same direction as essentially every other function in the building. And that's where, that expression change or die comes to mind. Because that's the reality. And it's not just HR's reality, it's the business's reality. We're in the throes of a shift age, that's following on the heels of the information age, that's accelerating so rapidly. And you can either be overwhelmed by it, or you can recognize that we are being handed an opportunity which has literally never existed in the history of humanity. And that's the ability to not just experience change, but to shape it. I mean, if you think about it, the changes that we are confronting are evolving almost in real time. And so we have an opportunity to respond to them. And that's where, the man who wrote the article that you're referring to, Ram Charan, I just adore. I think he is a brilliant business guru. And his summation, as I recall it, was basically that CEOs would just like to be able to have their CHROs or their CPOs or whatever they call them and use them, or not necessarily utilize them, and partner with them the same way they do with their CFOs and their COOs. They want them to be trusted partners, were the words that he used. And I think whenever you get into this conversation about the role of HR and the future of HR, the concept of being a trusted partner is foundational to the discussion. If you think about, Jessica, if an organization today is going to navigate the chaos of our global markets, much less thrive in it, I mean, let's just talk about navigating it. We are going to be required to have a generation of enlightened leadership. And it doesn't matter what you call the HR department. The need and the opportunity that's being presented to us is to define that leadership, to recruit and hire those leaders, to shape and develop those leaders. And so it's enormous responsibility, but it's enormous opportunity. And process-driven and beholden HR are ultimately going to report to a CFO or CAO. And that's not tragic. I mean, we need folks with those job skills. But even if you look into the rank of, highly specialized compensation benefit specialists, total reward specialists, we still need new thinking along with new skill sets if their work is truly going to drive performance.
When I read the article, I was upset. I think initially, like a lot of people were, but the more I thought about it, I mean, you think about like a CFO role, there is an accountant, right? Or somebody who maybe in a controller who specializes in a particular area, so that the CFO can focus on the larger, broader sort of view and strategy for the organization. And so in those aspects, I have refocused my earlier position and said, you know what? Maybe this guy's right. It does need to be split because it is hard to be strategic, but administrative at the same time.
Well, think about, here's similarity. Think about what has happened to the marketing function and think about what has happened to the IT function. So, the IT department used to live in the bowels of the building in a very dark room somewhere where people wore black and didn't really come out of their offices very often. Okay. Now, when you think about this as an HR executive, you know dang well you cannot get anything done without a partnership with IT. And you think about the marketing department that now all of a sudden is dealing with mobile, social, analytics, ditto on the HR side. Well, IT has to be an integrated partner. And so you're starting to see the emergence of these chief digital officers. Well, what the heck's a chief digital officer? And, where you actually have IT and marketing coming up to that role. So, I think what you're seeing in HR will be the same thing, that it won't be either or, it won't be linear. But it clearly, back to change or die, it clearly is going to evolve.
I agree. I just published a blog post over on the Talent Circles site, and I was talking about how HR and IT should play nice together because now HR is becoming more heavily focused on technology. There is just such a reliance on IT and a need for them to work together because sometimes the IT department in certain organizations is responsible for the HRIS system or the ATS. So every organization's a little bit different.
Of course. Absolutely. And I can give you, I'll take 1 second and give an example that your audience can relate to. So this comes out of the world of casual dining. So anybody who's a consumer understands that what has happened in casual dining in the last, say, 10 years, 15 years, is that there is this giant sea of sameness in terms of the concepts that operate in that world. The Applebee's, the Chili's, the Fridays, the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we have studied casual dining for a long time. And a lot of our original People Report members were in casual dining. Well, we also track some of the best brands in the business. I mean, companies who are in People Report tend to be good brands. They tend to care about their workplaces. They tend to want to make them better. And they tend to care about best practices, and they have. And as you know, one of the unintended outcomes of best practices and focus on best practices, ultimately, everybody ends up doing the same thing. And so what we discovered several years ago was that in the world of benefits and in the world of incentive compensation and variable pay, that what had occurred was the commoditization of those benefits and those variable pay programs to the point where we could look at it, lay out all the correlations, and there was exactly no correlation to performance between the pay programs and performance, like none.
Wow.
It looked like a scatter plot. And this is Dan Pink 101.
Sure.
I mean, but we had the data that showed that. And so what we started talking about was, okay, how are you going to differentiate? How are you going to think at a different level? How are you going to come up with something that matches your organization, your culture, your business, and will be meaningful, but will still incent performance? And that's where, I said, new skill set, new way of thinking. Doesn't matter what role you're in the organization. You just have to have it.
Well, let's switch back over to the HR side of the house again and talk about credibility and how HR, in your opinion, and maybe some sage advice as a CEO, how can HR folks gain more credibility with senior business leaders and CEOs? Where should they start?
I get asked this a lot. And I have come to an answer that may be an oversimplification, but I tend to believe it's true. And that is, Jessica, simply, you have to do the work. You just have to do the work. You have to know your industry. You have to develop your business acumen. You have to understand why any area of your responsibility matters to the performance of the business, what I was just talking about. And if you can't do that, or if you discover it doesn't matter, then you should either be outsourcing that function, or you should figure out where that proverbial ROI really is and be able to demonstrate that. And none of that is easy. It's, and I really believe that to play, to put the uniform on, suit up, and get in the game, that's where your specific functional skills come to play. And so obviously the goal is to be the best at your game. I mean, the goal is to go through every single one of your webinars and your podcasts that are available to you, and to continue to utilize the resources that are out there to help you develop in your function. But if you want to gain credibility with senior business leaders, and you want them to think about you in a bigger role, or you want to move closer to that trusted partnership that Sharon was describing, you just have to do the work to get there.
I feel enlightened because I'm thinking about my own career path, right? And how I started out when we first met each other, and with my blog, and just the different things I've been exposed to, and thinking about building my business and my personal and professional growth. And you're right. It's just a matter of doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds so simple, but it requires a lot of time and really, I think, diligent effort to understand what is required of you, and how, and have a path to get there.
Yeah, I learned from a very young engineer and technologist who I worked with a long time ago. And we were working with an outsourced resource on a project. And the project moved until it stopped moving. And I remember talking to this guy about what was going on. Did we need more resources? What did we need to do? And he very simply said, no. He said, they just quit when it got hard. He said, the reason nothing's happening is because it's hard. and so they quit working on it. And at the time I thought, oh, okay. But a lot of times it's come back to haunt me when you really get to a point where it just seems like it's easier just to say, well, forget about it. If it matters, you find a way to do the work.
It's as simple as that, but do the work, and it's hard. And when it does get hard,
Mm-hmm.
people, you tend to find out who people are, if they're really serious about what all the smack talk and the things they've been saying that they'll do.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
We're going to take a little bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is HR and workplace trends. I'm here with the CEO of TDN2K, Joni Doolin. And we're talking about workplace trends for 2015. So earlier in the podcast here, we talked about 2014, looking back. So now I want to focus more on the future and looking into 2015. What focuses do you think that HR should be thinking about or planning for 2015?
Well, I mentioned the shift in the job market earlier, and we've had the luxury of an employer's market for almost 7 years now. And so even good companies have fallen into complacency regarding their people and their people practices. And, it almost amuses me sometimes. I'm starting to hear these horror stories, quote unquote, that HR officers are telling about candidates actually turning down their offers. And they're just horrified that they spent all this time recruiting this person and interviewing this person, and they finally get around to making them a job offer, and somebody turned it down. And so, we've just had 7 years of being pretty sure that someone would take your job, even in the entry-level services job. And that gig is up. And the other thing that we assumed was that, everybody was obviously delighted with their work because they were staying in place, even though, we get survey after survey that tells us, that everybody hates their jobs. But that's not how companies have responded. So that's over too. The whole assumption about engagement or satisfaction is over. The percentage of people quitting their jobs has increased 5% just in the last quarter. So I believe that really good HR leaders right now don't need a crystal ball to know that business as usual isn't really good business when it comes to talent management. And the key word there is talent.
I'm seeing a lot of movement in the engagement space, but you mentioned compensation, and I think it bears just repeating that you are seeing it become a employee or a candidate's marketplace. And so perks and maybe a great culture are no longer going to be enough to retain your best workers.
That's correct.
As I also mentioned, your industry and TD and 2K takes a lot of time, as we've said over the course of this podcast, evaluating economic trends. And this information has been fabulous thus far. And it's been interesting having spent quite a bit of time in the Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been kind of part of the tech bubble and seen kind of that particular area grow, even in a relatively short time of 14 months. Housing prices, they were already out of control before, but even more so, the house that we were renting in a period of 11 months, the price, the purchase price of the home rose over $400,000, which is just unheard of. But I've also been reading a lot of articles about how some economists are predicting the tech bubble to burst in the Silicon Valley area. And I wondered if you were seeing a similar thing in your research, specifically in the service industry.
Well, I was going to say, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to opine on the tech bubble. I think it's very sexy cocktail conversation, but in reality, it doesn't impact, it really doesn't impact the economy that much, and it certainly doesn't impact service sector. In the articles I have read about tech, though, just to tie back to your comments, what I am seeing is the fact that compensation in tech is being hyperinflated again, just in the last couple years, and that non-cash comp has been hauled out of mothballs as a recruitment incentive for highly skilled workers. And I do think that's an outlier, and it's a little bit of a bellwether for what's going on in compensation overall, just for the highly skilled workforce, for those mission critical employees that doesn't matter what their title is. If they leave the building, something's not happening that you need to happen. And I also think that non-cash comp issue will be an Achilles heel for a lot of these companies that are being funded that aren't making any money. So for what that's worth, the conundrum of a tightening labor market in general is that wages are essentially still flat. We saw a little tiny bit of growth last quarter, but we have an employer mindset that is still extremely reluctant to make aggressive hire offers or to offer more than a 3% or a 4% increase. And that is just unsustainable. I mean, that is not sustainable. In the past, before Great Recession, you wanted to hire a worker, you couldn't get the people you wanted, you increased the wage offer. But we haven't had to do that for 7 years. And so a lot of businesses don't believe that we should have to do that now.
They're missing out on great people.
Yeah.
They're going other
well,
places.
When they get, as you're going to have unfilled job openings, companies aren't going to have any choice. But, do you want to lead that or be behind that trend?
I also think, too, that the contingent market is really growing. So folks like me who are entrepreneurs or freelancers, they are leaving the traditional workforce. And that's another, they are able to make their own rules and pick their own projects.
Mm-hmm. This is true. And, we also have, of course, the huge socioeconomic shift of millennials entering the workplace. And, so you have what, the numbers better than I do, 80 million new employees and consumers entering these markets who have very different values about work. And so the legacy workplace practices that we have hung on to probably a decade longer than we should have in the first place. But that's been abated by the recession. Work. I think we're in for a roller coaster ride.
I've been waiting for this moment as a younger Gen Xer my whole life.
Yeah.
Now I am the boss, right?
Absolutely.
I'm making the rules. So
That's right.
it's definitely going to be an interesting time. I know we mentioned the couple of some research which we're going to link to. Is there any recommendations as far as like places folks should go to be able to get additional information or resources to be able to be better in their jobs and be more, I guess, more strategic in HR or learn more about these trends?
I knew you were going to ask me that question. I thought about it. I mean, there's tons of resources. I'd like to offer a couple books that, again, I think are more business books. And I think they are the type of books that help you think about the future of business in general, and the role of the workplace in those businesses. One of them I already mentioned, Shift Age, is written by a man named David Houle, who is absolutely a brilliant futurist, but he comes out of the world of entertainment. I mean, he was on the forefront of creating things like MTV and Nickelodeon, and he was involved in headline news with CNN when it first started. I mean, he's been on the forefront of a lot of these changes for a long time. But David writes about these transitions from the standpoint that you really can start to get a picture of how these shifts impact you personally, professionally, societally, as a community, and it's just brilliant work. How by Dov Seidman. Seidman he's been studying this for a couple decades now, and he's writing about how we do anything means everything. It's like no matter what we do, it's how we do it, which is foundational to both the employment brand, the value proposition for an employee, a value proposition for a consumer. I think that book is brilliant. And then, the last one, this is just a personal, something that I have become deeply involved in, and that's Conscious Capitalism. And the book, most recent book, is written by John Mackey, who's CEO of Whole Foods, and a professor named Raj Sisodia. And their tagline for the book is liberating the heroic spirit of business. So essentially what they're talking about is taking the traditional stakeholder model of capitalism and elevating it so that indeed the business begins to elevate the lives of the people that it touches. And I have found more original thinking about where our workplaces need to be headed in that movement, in that conscious capitalism movement, than I have just about any place else.
I go into your events. That's when I was first exposed to the idea of conscious capitalism and how you guys are approaching it. And I have not read the book, but I'm making a note to myself to add these to my audiobook list for sure.
There you go.
And I'll have the books that Joni has listed as recommended resources included in the podcast as well. I wanted to thank you, Joni, for taking the time today to talk on the Workology podcast. Where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
Well, our website is tdn2k.com. And when you land there, you can connect with all of our brands: People Report, Black Box Intelligence, White Box Social Intelligence, all of our blogs, our Twitter streams, resources, etc. And then my own blog is thekindnesseconomy.com.
And then you can also connect with Joni on Twitter too.
And I was just going to say.
Lucky Penny. It's one of my favorite Twitter handles.
Yeah. At Lucky Penny.
Well, thanks, Joni.